So my name's Gary Woodman. I'm Chief Executive of the Worcestershire Local Enterprise Partnership, and this is part of the series that we've been doing with Harrison Clark Rickerbys in relation to the COVID-19 response and the sort of issues and legal issues that businesses have been facing. Today I've got Michael Stokes with me. Michael, welcome.
Hello.
Michael, do you want to introduce your role within HCR?
Yeah, I'm the Head of Employment and Immigration at HCR, and I've been there around 9 years now, based in Worcester.
Okay. So, in terms of, I suppose, this time, employment issues have really been at the forefront of companies, haven't they?
Yeah, it's been a ridiculously busy time, as you might imagine, with the invention of furlough, the more old-fashioned law about sending people home for less money than they're meant to be paid, all the worries about going back to work, restructuring, home working, flexible working, everything. It's been a busy time for employment lawyers, I think.
Yeah. And the furloughing scheme in particular that you mentioned there, why do you think it's been so difficult to kind of understand and pick your way through, both from a kind of, I suppose, employer point of view, but also legally it's been a bit of a challenge as well, it seems?
Yeah, I think that after 8 weeks, I've reconciled it in my own mind by thinking that it's just a grant application. That's all it was. It was only ever meant to be a set of rules for claiming money from the government via the revenue, and it wasn't ever meant to be new employment law. What's happened over the last couple of months is that every employment lawyer of any stripe, and especially the poor employment law barristers who haven't got any work on at the moment, have all been poring over each version of the guidance, desperately trying to work out exactly what it means, as if it was holy writ. And I think they've been trying to learn about furlough like they're learning a language off the ingredients tab on the side of a packet of cornflakes. They've got no chance.
Yeah, real challenge.
Exactly. But really, the way it's all played out is that I think that the government, by updating the guidance every so often, sometimes quite quickly, they've pretty much got to where they ought to have been. I'm not critical of them in any way. This has happened very, very quickly. They've had to invent the word, invent the scheme, invent the rules. What's been difficult for employment lawyers, I suppose, is that it crashes into some quite difficult old bits of employment law, some of which haven't really been argued about for a long time, or if ever.
Okay.
So,
yeah, give us some examples of some of those.
Yeah, I mean, the main one that has come up time and time again is the interaction of holiday and furlough. So first of all, people were worried about whether, if you're on furlough, if you've been told to go home and not do any work by your employer and you'd agreed to do that, could you be sick? Or more importantly, could you be on holiday? Could you possibly be in those two states at the same time, on holiday and on furlough? And of course, no one knew. No one had, because no one knew what furlough was. No, there's no legal definition of what furlough is in employment law, because it's not an employment law concept. So what we've had to go back to is some law that came in 22 years ago that not many people remember, certainly didn't remember until a couple of months ago, about employers being able to make employees take paid holiday for their own health and safety. That was the idea, to take time away from work.
But quite an old piece of legislation 22 years ago.
Well, it's years old. I remember, I'm old enough to remember it came in. And but the thing I know is that...
Off as well.
Yeah, but the point about it is that no one, I don't think employers have ever really relied on that possibility, because they didn't need to. They hardly ever need to impose holiday, because there's not usually an argument between employers and employees that holiday is to be taken. But in this case, it obviously suited employers to try to get people to take some holiday while they were furloughed, and so it became a live issue. The most recent document that's come out about it is the government's own guidance, very helpful guidance on holidays generally and furlough, and even that guidance mentions the question but doesn't venture an answer. I mean, the nub of the problem is quite a fancy European law point, which is paid holiday is meant to be a health and safety benefit. So it's a duty on employers to make it happen and a right for employees to take it.
Okay.
So, and a holiday is meant to be time away to relax. And so the point is that, is it possible for someone to take relaxing holiday when they're locked in a box with their partner, 6 dogs and 12 children? Can that really amount to relaxing time away from work? And so, of course, there's been no case law on that, but there may well be now.
Yeah. And certainly with people working from home, you can see that balance. Well, are you then having that time away from work, and are you able to kind of use it as that relaxing time?
Yeah.
When I think we all find that blur between working from home and the home life gets a bit harder, I think.
Well, I mean, that's definitely, I mean, the home working point is, you're right, a separate point, because, we're working from home. It throws up particular difficulties. It's nice in many ways, for lots of people, and for other people, it's an absolute disaster if they're trying to work from home and they've got childcare responsibilities, or they're caring for someone, or they've just got practical problems about doing the particular job they're meant to do. Personally, it's worked a treat because I can get a decent signal if I go into the garden. I can give advice, I can tap away on the computer indoors. That's all been fine. There'll be plenty of people who really struggle, who are trying to share a Wi-Fi connection with 4 or 5 other people, who are all trying to watch something on Netflix for 2 or 3 hours. It's not easy for everyone.
No, and certainly as furloughing's been extended, and again, not everyone can work from home, but as furloughing kind of has been extended, but you can see the sort of taper that I think the Chancellor has tried to put on that. What do you sort of see with employers and clients of bringing those issues to you right now?
They're starting to think about whether they can keep everyone in the long term. The difficulty employers have got, one of the difficulties they've got, is that they, like us, haven't got a clue what the medium-term future holds. They might be best advised to plan as if everything's going to be working at about 1/3, half capacity in terms of getting people into the workplace, and plan around that. So some of my clients were already thinking about changing hours, changing days of work, put people on effectively on shift systems, even people working in offices, to put them on maybe occasionally working at weekends, which sounds, in an ordinary sense, to an employment lawyer, that sounds outrageous. If you're an office worker, you're used to a 9 to 5, Monday to Friday sort of existence. But if you change everything and say you are at home 7 days a week, and so that we can keep you as an employee and keep the place running, we might need you to work every 3rd Saturday. Plenty of employees would take that much more than they might do in an ordinary situation if you ask them.
Yeah. So there's really got to be this kind of communication between the employer and the employee, as a group and as an individual, really, because I suppose those who are in also vulnerable circumstances, who are shielding, the employer's really got to think about how they bring them back in at some point. And I suppose you've got all those anxieties.
Yeah, I think the employers have got a real headache approaching, as far as the employees coming back and not wanting to come back and concerned, or being worried about coming back, for completely understandable health reasons of theirs or to do with their family members. So whereas the furlough exercise was done in bulk and employees were generally racing the employers to the door to get out, to be safe and away from everyone else at the beginning of this process, so they were quite happy to accept quite significant changes very, very quickly. When everyone comes back, it's every person for themselves. They all have different home circumstances. They all have different, routes to work. Who will be on public transport? Who will be driving? How do people sit or stand when they're actually at work? What have they got going on at home? Have they got anyone who's shielding, who's vulnerable? So I think employers are going to have to deal with a lot more individual issues than they did when furlough first came in. And you're right, there's going to have to be a lot of communication so that employers know what is easy and what is difficult for people. That's going to be very time consuming, I think.
Yeah, and certainly that sort of change in the workplace and change of how we go. The implications on employment law going forward? Do you think the government will come in with new kind of employment law?
I think they'll be desperate not to. I think, if anything, the furlough scheme, which is a massive state intervention, effectively a state-funded layoff scheme of an old-fashioned kind for the whole economy, that when they did that, that's very far-reaching. But they kept away from employment law. They said they weren't doing anything to change employment law. I suspect whatever happens next, I think the government will want to try not to do anything to strengthen or weaken employment law, depending on whether you're an employer or an employee. They're just rather everyone just got through this situation on the basis of the current law, because I think about this in terms of employment legislation.
Yep.
The things to do with returning to work, for example, lots of health and safety issues there, GDPR, asking for information from employees about their very personal circumstances, their health conditions and so on, so that the employer can be reasonable and helpful and cooperative. But you're going to be sitting on a mass of personal data. And there have already been situations where big employers have spilled the beans accidentally.
You're going to see how they're going to have to really look after and think about things, really taking it steps by step at a time, aren't they? It doesn't matter whether you're a manufacturer, and certainly we were talking to a few of those recently, and they were sort of saying, they were moving pieces of equipment out, but how do they get back up to that productivity level, I think, is going to be a real challenge. And then equally on the flip side of that, the kind of office side of things, where how do they kind of also integrate the teams when often the sales team, the accounts, the HR, you think, oh, well, they can work from home, but actually the whole operation needs to be integrated. And I think in many work organisation, that's the piece. And I think it's been interesting that the guidance is really based on a risk assessment approach, which maybe puts the liability on the employer.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the employer is going to have to carry out and then effectively publish their risk assessment. So that's got to happen. I think the effect then on employees is that they will be in effect be able to make sure that their employer is playing it by the book, and employers are going to have to be careful when they're responding to employees who are going to be very careful about going back to work. And employers may be tempted, not all, some may be tempted to overreact to reluctance on the part of some employees to make their way back to work, because they may feel naturally skeptical about whether are they really worried? Is this genuine? But I think an employer who's got that mindset and whose default position might be, I know what's good for you, there's no reason why you can't get back. If you won't come back, I'm going to see you off the premises. They're going to end up in the tribunal quite a lot, I should think, over the next couple of years.
Yeah, and so certainly there, the kind of conversation we've had is really around what you can start to see is those complexities really coming into this, and it's really not going to be simple. But what sort of top tip would you have for employers looking to come back from lockdown, whether they've started to or whether they're going to over the next sort of 3 to 4 weeks?
I think the subject to the point I was making before about data protection, GDPR, and having systems that are robust enough not to disclose data unintentionally, I think my top tip is just to set up systems that do find out whether employees have problems, to prompt them to say whether they've got problems, and then to address them with an open mind. It may be that even though we're not in the same situation as when furlough started, that there may be employees who don't want to come back and there'll be employees who are desperate to get back. It may be that the volume of returners that the employer wants matches the volume of people who are willing to come back. So it could just be a question of we can only fit in half of the office staff. Let's find out who is keen to come back and has no problems. And employers will just want to regulate that. But that's a big job. That is a big job. And I think that my top tip would be start early and as I say, don't be too sceptical, because there'll be employees who have never been any difficulty in the past, or there may even be employees who have been a right pain in the neck for years, but they might have a completely genuine fear of returning to work because of their own safety or the safety of their family. So I think employers got to be really careful not to fall into any traps there, and just get into punch-ups unnecessarily.
And so definitely, it is working alongside your professional advisors, really, in terms of taking it step by step and making sure that you put in and do the right steps in terms of ensuring that you're inside that employment law, or certainly you're taking the right steps and advice. I think is probably the other key element of here.
I'm bad to say this, but it is the case that it's much, much better to get some early advice about whether what you've got in mind looks okay, looks robust, looks legally robust, than having the conversation in 6 or 8 weeks' time when you've already got some fights on your hands, and people who are not happy at not being allowed back or being made to come back. So it's always better with employment law to find out first, get some advice first. As I say, I just say that's my living, but it's usually much cheaper to get the early advice than to try and mop up afterwards if you've gone wrong.
Yeah, and I think certainly with this situation and how we can recover from this, it definitely is. We're having that working relationship, not just between employer-employees, but also advisor, is really fundamental to sort of steering a way through the legislation and, you're right, the furlough scheme, and then all the other bits and pieces related to employment law and making sure that actually the business comes back fully operational.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one difficulty here is that because of the pandemic in the background, the whole problem in the first place, that's just lumped together some areas of law that have never been in the same room together before. And so it would be easy for legal advisors looking at all that law to panic and say, you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that. So that can't work for businesses. They need advice about what they can do and how they can navigate their way through admittedly difficult situations. There's always a way to do it. And it's best not to find out by being the first test case in the Court of Appeal.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michael. That's been really informative, and certainly I've learned some bits and pieces, and it certainly made me think about things as we implement starting to move back into the office from a local enterprise partnership point of view. But also, I think, it's given plenty of food of thought in terms of how we all do this over this coming period. I'm sure we'll have to adapt.
Yeah, absolutely. We enjoyed it. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.